People often think discipline is just about habits or willpower, waking up early, pushing through pain, sticking to a schedule, and those things matter, but they aren't the full story. They're what discipline looks like from the outside, not where it comes from. Carl Jung didn't talk about discipline the way a productivity coach might. He wasn't interested in to-do lists or daily routines. He was trying to understand why we do what we do, and why we so often fail to do the things we say we want. If you look at discipline through Jung's eyes, it becomes less about control and more about self-awareness. Because without that awareness, you're just reacting, caught in patterns you don't even recognize, saying you want to change while repeating the same loop. That's where most people live. Not because they're weak, but because they don't know what's really driving them. Jung believed that much of our behavior is shaped by parts of ourselves we don't see clearly, the parts we've pushed down, ignored, or never fully understood. He called this the unconscious. And it's not just a dark basement of repressed memories. It's everything that acts through you without your full awareness. Discipline doesn't begin with forcing yourself to act differently. It begins with seeing yourself more clearly, with understanding what you avoid, what you crave, what you're afraid of, and that takes more than effort. It takes honesty. One of the psychological laws you can draw from Jung's work is that what you resist internally often grows stronger. If you try to discipline yourself by just ignoring your impulses, burying your feelings, pretending your doubts don't exist, they don't go away. They wait. They find other ways to show up, in procrastination, in distraction, in self-sabotage. So the first move toward real discipline isn't suppression, it's recognition. You have to know what you're fighting. Not just the behavior, but the emotion underneath it, the fear, the shame, the craving for comfort or escape. Discipline without that understanding will always feel like a fight against yourself. Jung also pointed out that people are made of opposites, light and shadow, thought and emotion, desire and restraint. And if you deny one side of yourself, the other doesn't just disappear, it distorts. It shows up in ways you don't control. Discipline means working with all parts of yourself, not just the ones you like. If you try to build discipline by pretending you're always rational, or always calm, or always strong, you're setting yourself up for failure. Because you're not, and you don't have to be. You just have to stop hiding from what you are. Another principle that comes from Jung's thinking is the idea that growth comes from tension, not from peace. People want to feel balanced, settled, but real change usually starts with conflict. Inner conflict, a sense that your current way of living doesn't fit anymore. Most people try to run from that discomfort. They distract themselves, they numb it. But that discomfort is a signal. It means you're being pulled in two directions: who you are and who you might be. And that tension, if you face it, is the space where discipline begins. Not because someone told you to be better, but because you start wanting to be different than you are, not from guilt, but from clarity. And that clarity doesn't come from motivation alone. It comes from observation, noticing what you're doing, when, and why. Jung saw that much of what people call weakness is really unconscious resistance. They say they want something, but part of them is afraid of it, or unsure of what it would even mean to succeed. That's why effort without insight often leads to burnout. You push yourself forward, but something inside keeps pulling you back, and instead of exploring that tension, most people treat it like failure. But discipline that ignores the inner conflict is shallow. It might work for a while, but it won't last. One of the most important insights Jung offered was that you don't get stronger by rejecting your weakness, you get stronger by understanding it. That means looking directly at the parts of yourself that hesitate, doubt, avoid, or collapse. Not to shame them, but to understand what they're trying to protect. Because every defense, even the irrational ones, has a reason. And if you can uncover that reason, your resistance stops being a mystery. It becomes something you can work with, not something you have to fight. Jung believed that people are always in the process of becoming. That means discipline isn't about controlling yourself into a fixed identity. It's about guiding the process of transformation. Letting go of old stories, outgrowing patterns that once kept you safe. Choosing the discomfort of growth over the comfort of familiarity. And that's not a straight path. Discipline, in Jungian terms, is not rigid. It's not about holding the same shape every day. It's about having a direction, a kind of psychological gravity, and returning to it again and again, even when you drift. Another psychological law that comes through Jung's work is that symbols and meaning matter a lot. Discipline that's only mechanical wears out fast, but when your actions are tied to meaning, not imposed meaning, but meaning you've discovered, the work becomes more sustainable. You're not just doing it for the outcome. You're doing it because it reflects who you're trying to become. This is why goals that come from ego, status, attention, praise often collapse under pressure. They're too thin. But goals that grow from inner work, from understanding your patterns, your values, your fears, tend to last. They're connected to the whole person, not just the surface. Jung also talked about the shadow, the parts of yourself you don't want to see. And here's where it ties directly to discipline. Many people fail to stay disciplined not because they're lazy or weak, but because they haven't faced the shadow. They avoid responsibility, they distract themselves. But those behaviors don't come out of nowhere. They come from things hidden: fear of failure, fear of success, past shame, unacknowledged anger. The more you deny your shadow, the more it controls you. But when you bring it into awareness, you start to integrate those energies. You stop pretending to be only good, only focused, only pure, and you start becoming whole. Wholeness doesn't mean you don't struggle. It means you're honest about the struggle. And honesty is the foundation of real discipline. Because when you lie to yourself, even with good intentions, it catches up with you. Your energy gets divided, your actions get confusing, and the loop of self-sabotage starts again. To break that loop, you don't need more guilt. You need more understanding. You need to ask harder questions about your habits, your choices, and what you're avoiding. Not because you're flawed, but because you're complex. And complexity doesn't have to mean chaos, it can mean depth. Discipline built on depth lasts longer because it includes the full person, not just the polished surface, not just the part that looks good in public, but the part that struggles late at night, the part that's been wounded, the part that wants to quit. When that part is seen and acknowledged, something changes. It stops needing to act out. It stops needing to pull you down because it's no longer being ignored. And when it's no longer ignored, it becomes part of your strength. Not because it disappears, but because you've made room for it. You've taken what was hidden and brought it into view. That's what Jung meant by integration. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. Real discipline starts to feel less like forcing yourself and more like aligning yourself. You're not dragging your weaker parts forward. You're helping them catch up. You're teaching them to speak the same language as your goals instead of shutting them out. Another thing Jung made clear is that projection is everywhere. When we see something in others that we refuse to face in ourselves, we project it. That goes for laziness, fear, arrogance. Anything we deny inside gets spotted outside. This matters for discipline because people often get stuck in judgment, blaming others for what they won't own in themselves. If you're constantly criticizing other people's lack of discipline, but secretly struggle to follow through in your own life, you might be projecting, and projection blocks growth. It keeps you locked in a story that puts the problem somewhere else, which means the solution stays out of reach too. But when you stop projecting and start owning your patterns, the work becomes personal again. And personal work even when it's hard, is powerful because it leads somewhere real. Another psychological law buried in Jung's thought is that energy has to go somewhere. If you suppress emotion, it doesn't disappear. It turns into something else. If you ignore longing, it often turns into resentment. If you bottle up anger, it can become apathy or bitterness. Discipline, in this view, isn't about suppressing energy, it's about channeling it, about recognizing what's rising in you and finding a direction for it. If you're angry, maybe that anger is pointing to something that needs to change. If you're restless, maybe it's a signal you've outgrown something. But if you ignore those signals, they don't vanish. They build pressure. And pressure, when left unchecked, almost always breaks through, often at the worst time in the worst way. But when you listen to it early, when you learn how to read it, you can move before the explosion. You can act from awareness, not reaction. That's what unbreakable discipline really means, not that you never fail, but that your structure is flexible enough to bend without breaking, that you've built something from the inside out, not the outside in. A lot of people try to borrow discipline from someone else's system, a routine they read online, a method someone swore by, and sometimes that works for a while. But real discipline has to be personal. It has to reflect who you are and who you're trying to become. Jung's work helps you start that process, not with shortcuts or hacks, but with insight. He doesn't tell you what to do. He asks you to look at what you fear, what you avoid, what you believe without questioning. And that kind of looking, quiet, steady, honest, changes things, slowly, then suddenly. You stop needing to be perfect. You stop waiting for motivation. You start showing up because you understand why you weren't before. You've pulled the roots of your behavior out of the dark. Discipline stops being a fight and starts being a practice. Not something you win at, but something you return to. Not something you prove, but something you live. And in that shift, things start to hold. And when things start to hold, it's not because you've become a different person overnight. It's because you've stopped pretending to be someone else. You're not chasing an ideal version of yourself anymore. You're working with who you actually are, in real time, with all the weight and complexity that comes with that. Jung's approach to personal growth doesn't offer guarantees. It doesn't promise fast results or dramatic transformations. What it offers is depth, a way of thinking that respects the parts of you that most systems overlook. The doubt, the contradiction, the fear of change, the fear of staying the same. He knew that people don't change just because they decide to. They change when they start to see clearly, when the things they used to ignore become impossible to unsee, when the parts of themselves that used to sabotage them start to feel less like enemies and more like messages that were never fully heard. This is the part where real discipline separates itself from discipline as performance. It's no longer about how others see you. It's about whether your actions match what you actually value. Whether you're willing to build consistency even when no one is watching. Even when nothing feels urgent. Even when you don't get applause. Jung also reminded us that the unconscious isn't just a place of fear and trauma. It's also the source of creativity, vision, and strength you didn't know you had. When you begin to face the darker parts, you also start unlocking the deeper ones, the places where your energy lives, your clarity, your focus. And those things can't be forced, they have to be uncovered. That's why so much of this process doesn't look like action at first. It looks like stillness, observation, reflection. And that can feel slow until it starts working. Then you begin to notice the distractions don't pull you the same way they used to. The excuses lose their grip. The patterns that used to undo you don't seem as convincing anymore. Because you're no longer running from the parts of you that made discipline feel impossible. You've started including them in the work, and in that inclusion something unlocks. Discipline stops being a wall you hit and becomes a current you return to. Not every moment, not every day, but enough. Enough to carry you through the noise, through the fear, through the weeks that feel heavy and the days that feel pointless. Because it's not built on pressure. It's built on understanding. And understanding, once you have it, is hard to unlearn. That's why Jung's insights still matter. Not because they tell you what to believe, but because they invite you to see more clearly, to look beneath the surface, to notice what's been shaping your choices, and to start shaping those choices on purpose. It's what unbreakable discipline is. Not the ability to do everything perfectly, but the ability to return with clarity to what matters most. And when you do that long enough, it becomes less about effort and more about alignment, less about proving, more about becoming.